Have you ever wondered how an RPG book is made? How do you take something like this awesome adventure and create it? Or something like one of the books behind me, Acquisitions Incorporated for an official D&D book, or The Forge of Foes, created with Mike Shea and Scott Fitzgerald Gray. We're going to look at how any size creator can be part of the process of creating an RPG book. What does it take? What are the steps? How do we go about understanding or even being involved in the process of writing, editing, layout, print preparation, all of that? We're going to discuss this all with Scott Fitzgerald Gray. So it's important for folks, I think, to know, Scott, where they can find you and what you're involved in, because this video is going to be full of all kinds of recommendations, and they'll hear your advice and they may say, oh, I want Scott as my editor or my layout person, or I want to see the things that Scott has created. So if you would take a moment to share with us, what do you provide to people and companies, and what are you, what can people like buy right now that you have, right? Like Hidden Halls or Core 20, like, tell me about all these awesome things you have.
All those things. Yeah, I work primarily as a developmental editor for RPGs. I focused specifically on the development side because I do a pretty deep dive into the stuff that I'm working on. So I focus on story, I focus on mechanics, I focus on language. I do like the whole thing. I've been doing this for quite a while. I freelanced for Wizards of the Coast for just almost exactly 20 years. I started working for them in 2004. The last two projects I worked on them for were Fizban's Treasury of Dragons and the marvelous little adventure that Sean Merwin wrote, Peril in Pinebrook, a little starter adventure for first-time DMs, first-time players. I have also worked on many other games. I most recently was the lead editor on Draw Steel, the MCDM RPG just released. I did a tiny bit of editing work, very small amount of work on Daggerheart, alongside some other amazing editors. I am primarily working right now on my own game, which is a game called Core 20, which is a D20-based game, an extension of D&D that plays the game in a way that I've always wanted to try D&D, which is no classes and no levels. It's in playtest right now. It's absolutely free, and you're welcome to go check it out at core20rpg.com.
Core20rpg.com.
If you want to... Yeah, if you want to find me anywhere else, easiest place is probably on Blue Sky or on Mastodon Dice Camp, where I am Scott F. Gray in both places. I also have a sporadically updated website at insaneangel.com, which has a contact form there. I will say in advance, I am probably too busy at this point for you to hire me, which I know is a wonderful problem to have as a freelancer. I'm very blessed in terms of the work that I do and the people that I get to work with, but I'm always happy to answer questions or to yak about kind of the state of the industry, what editing is about. So if you have any questions about anything that got raised here today, please absolutely feel free to post on Blue Sky or Mastodon and ask a question, and I am happy to respond there.
I can't, folks who are hearing this video will see all of that advice you have and why you're so coveted and in demand by everybody out there. Because really, if any company were to say to me, who should I have to help me through this process? I would say, well, I'll have you talk to Scott. I mean, that's who I'd start with. So thanks for all that you do. And let's get into our topic today.
Sounds good.
For today's show, I'm really excited. I've got my good friend, Scott. Hey, Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing most excellently, Teos. How are you doing?
Lovely. And we're going to talk about how to build an RPG product, what goes into it, which, I think I can imagine two types of folks watching this video. One, folks who actually want to be in the business of creating RPGs and are trying to decide things like, should I buy art now? Should I, when do I need to stop messing with the layout? Things like that. Like they really want to get into the weeds of it and figure out what the process should be like, or at least know where to start with some knowledge. And then there's just the fan, like I was not many years ago, where I would just, pick up a book and go, that's beautiful. feels like magic. Somebody made this. I don't know. And you'd look at the table of contents and and the credits, and you'd say, oh, look, Scott Fitzgerald Gray's name is in there. That's cool. I have no idea what that really means, right?
Right.
And hopefully for that audience, for anybody who's just kind of watching this out of curiosity, this will be really interesting, I hope, to shed a light on what it takes to make an RPG book, because as I've gotten involved, I mean, it's amazing. There is so much to it. It's such a complex thing. What do you think on my opening thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I mean, I confess, I often, when I see my name in a book, I often have no idea what that means either. So I'm still trying to figure that out. But yeah, it's a great topic for conversation. It's a very interesting topic because stuff goes on in the RPG space that doesn't go on anywhere else in any other sort of creative form, right? Because you've got the RPG industry, such as it is, right, which has, like a small number of fairly large players, a larger number of, people who are, putting stuff out professionally, doing a great job, putting out great products that people like and enjoy. But then you've got this hobbyist space where hobbyists, hey, that's nice. You have this hobbyist space kind of under there where people have the opportunity to turn their ideas into finished products, in a it's not an easy process, but it's a straightforward process. There are steps that you can learn, right? And I love that doesn't really exist anywhere else, right? There's no such thing as like a novelist hobby space.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
There are people who write with the intention of becoming professional novelists at some point. Right. And that's always been the way it is. But it's not a communal thing. It's not like people get together every week, and, like write novels together with their friends. And then at the end of the day say, hey, I really liked what I wrote that this one time last week. I think I might try to publish that. Yeah. Right. And that's the kind of thing that happens in games all the time. People come up with cool ideas for character concepts. They come up with cool ideas for worlds and world building mechanics. And it's easy to say to yourself, hey, this is pretty cool. I'd like to share that with other people. And so hopefully we'll be able to give some advice on what that process looks like with you for people who want to go from I've got a cool idea. What can I do with this? Yeah. And then figure out what the next level, what the next stage is for that.
Yeah. And there's a group called Tabletop Mentoring that I helped with once. And it was like that, where folks would say, I guess I helped twice. I have an idea, what do I do with that? Right. And that's such a fascinating question. And then there's also, major companies where a fan might want to say, well, why wasn't the book like this? This is what the product should have been. Yeah. And we, on Mastering Dungeons, Sean and I spoke with Justice Ramin Arman, who was the lead for the starter set, Heroes of the Borderlands set. And he talked through just how complicated it is to go through all the concepting of what this should be and to play test and to, there's just so much that can go into a product. And at any point, something can change it up, right? And somebody from a marketing group could come in and say, you know what, we need this to have fewer tokens or more, or here's what the price point came back because of shipping and manufacturing. We need to change something, or we've got a demographic study in. This is what we should do to, and so that can change design at the bigger levels, right? At the larger companies, that can become more and more complex. And then you have a lot of up and coming people, even a book like Daggerheart is going to have a complex process because this is kind of their first book like this, even if they've done some other things. And so, once you communicate schedules and so on, it's going to be a very different endeavor. Yeah. So maybe let's start with that idea of the concept, right? Let's start with the idea of the idea. And I've enjoyed this process with you twice. You and I worked on Acquisitions Incorporated, and we worked on Forge of Foes, and both of those are, and we did Vault of the Dracolich, and I'd say kind of all three of those experiences were unusual in the industry, where you typically are working as a freelancer, and you are told what to do, and you may not even understand what the project exactly is, though you write for it. And with all of like Acquisitions Incorporated is especially interesting because this became an official D&D book. It started as a Penny Arcade project. And it started as the vaguest of ideas, even at the Penny Arcade level. They were like, we want to do this book. We're not exactly sure what should be in it. And so we got to sit down and think through what the chapters should be, which is incredibly unusual, especially for us being freelancers.
Yeah.
And then we got to pitch that essentially, and then get feedback back and forth, creative feedback with Penny Arcade, refine that into what we offered, began working on it, had to adjust a bit once it became a Wizards project, right? But that was a really interesting project.
Yeah. 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 It's a sort of, there's no one way that any RPG book starts out. Mm-hmm. Every book is going to have a slightly different life cycle that way. But ultimately, at the end of the day, everything starts with an idea, that there's a concept. Now, sometimes that concept may be purely creative. Sometimes it might be slightly market focused. And that doesn't, not just talking about big companies kind of looking at, we've done market research or we have focus groups, but it could often be like the thing that you just spoke of, where it's like a new book comes out and you're like, oh, I really wish it had done this thing. Right, that it didn't do because it didn't have space or didn't have time or they were focusing on other areas. Yeah. And you can respond to that by saying, you know what, I think I'm the person to write that thing. Right. So you can sometimes have a reaction to other things and sort of think this is something that the market needs. Yeah. Sometimes it's simply a matter of saying, I think this would be really cool. No,
I feel like Forge of Foes, which I'm holding up, is kind of.
I think Forge of Foes is both, honestly.
Yeah.
Right? Forge of Foes started out from the very basic idea of there's so much that can be talked about in terms of building great encounters, building great foes, building great monsters that D&D 5e really doesn't get into in as much detail as it could. Right. And part of that is just, the game at that point, at the time we wrote that was, 7, 8 years old, I think at that point when we started working on the book. Partly because anytime you're putting out a big book, you've got a core book, you've got a Dungeon Master's Guide, some things have to go, right? So you're going to have to focus in and say, we'd love to spend 30 pages on this. We've only got 10, and that happens to books at any level.
Yeah.
But yeah, it really was just sort of, we started off both from the perspective of saying, this is a book that people could be interested in because it doesn't exist in the market as such at this point. Right. There's nothing exactly like what we want to do. Mm-hmm. But it was also very much the idea of, if we're going to do this, what other cool ideas could we add to it? So, and the process of developing Forge of Foes really was a matter of going back and forth, I think, on both from both those points on an axis.
Yeah, that's great.
To come up with something that was quite unique, I think, and really a lot of fun to work on.
Yeah. And so I wonder what you think, because I've heard creators say this, at what point should I move forward with my idea? Yeah. Is the answer kind of whenever? Or is there some sweet spot?
Kind of. Yeah, I think you can. There are really two answers to that, right? And I mean, it kind of comes down to whenever, but you can isolate two different ways of looking at it. If you're writing something that is a project primarily that you're writing because you really want to do it, this is a passion project, it's a labor of love, you're thinking, I really want to, this is something I think I will have fun doing, right? And I think it's something other people will enjoy. Then the answer is start as soon as you feel like starting, right? There's no wrong time to start. Yeah. If it's more of a project where you're like, I think this is something people will buy, and I'm looking at it from the perspective of, okay, I think if I write this, if I create this, produce it, publish it, then it's something that will resonate with people. You might want to make sure that your instincts about that are correct first. You might want to do a little bit of market research. You might want to see what other products are out there that you weren't aware of that are covering the same sort of area. If you're thinking I've got a great new approach to Ancestry, for example, right? There are lots of great new approaches for Ancestry. But there are also lots that have already been done. So have a look at all of those, do some research, make sure that what you're doing is different enough from what other people have done already, that it has a chance to kind of, to become known and to make a name for itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, that sort of reminds me of another book I have here on hand, which is The Shadow of the Weird Wizard by Rob Schwab. Yes. Amazing with Shadow of the Demon Lord, his first book. It really felt like that sort of passion project. Of course, Rob is brilliant, which helps greatly. And we could also tell the story using 13th Age. But that idea of I think I'll probably make this book and it'll, probably land with some people. But then as, lo and behold, it's very popular for a book of its type and for a company that is an individual essentially, right? Or a couple of individuals for 13th Age. And Rob Hainsou for 13th Age has said, we never expected this to be more than a book. And then we found ourselves creating a product line, and now we're doing a second edition, right? And so it can be that sort of thing that it ends up, if you're very fortunate, your passion project becomes bigger than that. But, imagine if they had actually at 13th Age, Rob Hainsou and Tweet had thought to themselves, let's think about how we work the market for this, preparing for this, right? And which I think more groups are doing now, right? People are a little more Kickstarter savvy and so on with that kind of marketing. So I think your point is really good, that it, you want that idea, but also you want to think about how it's going to succeed in that marketplace. And I think if you're at a bigger organization, right? I've worked with a lot of large corporations. Then you have a lot of other things you have to deal with. Your idea has to be blessed by various departments. Groups have to be okay with it, and that may require massaging that idea into certain places before you can just start writing on it.
Yeah, that's a different sort of a question, like trying to do something that originates with you versus trying to do something that originates with someone else. And we talk about that in a second. One thing I just wanted to mention, though, talking about folks like Rob Hainsou and Rob Schwab, going back to the original starting point of this discussion, the idea of the idea. One of the things that's very important to think about as well, when you're in a position where you're like, I've got this cool idea. One cool idea is good. 10 cool ideas is better. Because what happens when you come up with more and more cool ideas is you realize, the first idea I had that I thought was really good is not as good as this next idea. Right. So that's another thing to think about. It's not the primary thing. But I think the example of like looking at 13th Age and looking at Shadow of the Demon Lord, Rob Hainsou and Rob Schwab are both people who've been doing RPG work for a long time. Right. Their job is to come up with cool ideas constantly on a daily basis. And I think with both those games, those are really good examples of things where they came up with cool ideas that they didn't get to implement elsewhere. Right. They were both, they both worked on 4E. Rob worked on 5E as well. Sorry, Rob Schwab worked on 5E. And in the process of doing stuff like that, you come up with concepts, you think, this would be really cool to do. Didn't get a chance to do it on this other project, but I'm going to hang on to this idea because it's just kind of, it's nagging at me that there's something really cool to develop there. I think for the most part, what people watching this are probably most interested in is, how do I do this myself? And we will definitely focus on that primarily as we're going along. But it's certainly also possible to be in a position where you get to do something for someone else, right? Where they're going to handle some part of the many things we're going to be talking about: hiring an editor, looking for art, right? Doing art orders, all that kind of stuff. But there's this relationship between you and them where you've both got to be very happy with what you're talking about doing, right? The one thing that's the most important probably for that sort of setup is experience, right? You're in the best position to work with other people if you know how to do the work already. So for that reason, right, it's usually a really good idea to try to do some of your own projects first, right? If you've never written anything for any RPG, it can be challenging to go to a company like Wizards of the Coast or Paizo or, anybody. And say to them, hey, I'd really like a chance to write for you. Because the first thing they will say is, that's great. We're always looking for new freelancers. Send us some samples, right? You have to have those samples. You have to have stuff that you have done and worked on. So that's a scenario that's changed a fair bit over the last, we'll say 10, 12 years. Because there was a point where primarily, we're going to talk a lot about D&D. We don't mean to talk about that exclusively. There's lots of, other great games are available. But writing for D&D for a lot of people, that's kind of the goal, right? And for a long time, if you wanted to write for D&D, the best way to do that was to start off writing for the magazines, Dungeon Magazine and Dragon Magazine. And for many, many years, going back to the AD&D era, that was kind of the pipeline for lots of new writers. Right? People who got to work on the game. The magazines disappeared with the advent of D&D Next and 5e. right?
Yep.
And nothing really replaced them. And so that's created a kind of a brand new ecosystem now where it's really all about what you can do as an individual independent creator.
Yeah.
Right? Whether you're doing stuff on DM's Guild, whether you're doing stuff on Drive-Thru, whether you're doing stuff on Itch, whatever your preferred platform is, right? You're in a position where you can say to yourself, I want to work on stuff. I want to do stuff, right?
Yeah.
Because I want to put a package together to show other people what I'm capable of doing.
Yeah. And that's super important because you've got to build up these skills of knowing how, what is it like to have somebody develop your work, and how do you, cope with it being edited, because it's important. You've got to have that. Everybody
you got to go through.
Yeah,
there's a number of steps that you can go through. I mean, it's perfectly feasible to just do something on your own. If that's what you want to do, if that's where you want to start, then don't let anything we talk about today in terms of you must have an editor. You should have, ideally more than one editor. You should treat proofreading as a separate stage of editing. Don't, shirk on that. We'll get to all that later. Right. But there's nothing wrong with saying, you know what? I don't think I'm quite there yet. I just want to work on something myself. Okay. That's great. Right. It's the first stage towards where you want to go. And this is a process, and there's a number of steps, and you don't need to leap in farther along in the process than you're comfortable doing, or that you want to, where you want to leap in at any point.
Yeah. Some advice that I've given in the past is that if all you have is this one idea that you currently have, then your career is kind of over already before it started. And the reality is that's untrue, right? The idea you have now that feels so special and amazing, a lot of times it's like a campaign world. I've always had this idea. Well, just make that, right? And because that's the thing that's really, if you're passionate about it, just make it and sell it however you can. And it probably won't sell as much as you want. It probably won't be as great as you are, but in the process of that, you'll learn skills and you'll come up with other ideas. You always do.
Yeah. Absolutely.
But also there is, you can have a situation where you can assess your skills in a couple of ways. The one I always recommend is consume lots of content, right? Read lots of amazing creations by amazing people, and you will naturally see, oh, wow, the way that Chris Perkins wrote this is a lot better than the way I wrote mine. And it's just the way it is. I mean, it's Chris Perkins. Yeah. And or Sean Merwin, that's really good. And so you just know that you have more to learn and keep climbing that hill. But that improves you, and it helps you know that I need to get better. And so it can be that you recognize I'm not quite where somebody like Wizards would want to hire me for whatever reasons. Maybe I don't know the Chicago manual style enough, or I haven't figured out how to create really engaging encounters yet, or whatever it might be. You can keep working on your writing and on your approach to get there. But let's assume, Scott, you want to say something?
I was just going to say, like, one last bit of sort of general overview advice that I think is very important, which kind of touches on what you're saying there. It's absolutely important, to steep yourself in as much of the, literature, quote unquote, of what you want to do. It's also equally important, and this can't be stressed enough, to actually do the writing, right? Talking about having one great idea that you really want to work on. Absolutely. If that's your passion, if that's your dream, then that's the thing you absolutely should do. But it will help you immensely if you also work on other stuff. And this isn't just related to RPGs. I also edit fiction from time to time when my schedule allows it. And one of the conversations that I have with fiction writers, more than anything else probably, is they will have this thing and they'll say, yeah, this is my novel. This is, I've been working on this. And I'm like, great, what else are you working on? And when they say to me, nothing, this is the only thing I've worked on. This is the one thing, right? I always have to say to them, you're hurting yourself. You are holding yourself back, right? Because working on one thing will improve your skills up to a point, but it will stall at some point because you get that one thing in your head, right? And you sort of get stuck on it. If you're the novel on the fiction side of things, one thing I say to people, like if you're working on a novel, right, you finish a draft, that's great. Put that away, write something else. Write something else before you go back to that draft, right? If you're working on a novel, write short stories. If you're writing short stories, work on something longer, right? Just to sort of change up the way that your mind interfaces with your own creativity. And on the RPG side of things, right, it's still absolutely true. Write as much as you can. Okay. And write with the idea, just like, tell yourself, I'm going to act like I'm writing this for publication, right? I'm going to take these notes that I made on some magic items or this monster that I kind of improv'd in the middle of a session, right? We had a great time. Everybody had fun fighting it. I'm going to take that and I'm going to actually write it up like it's an entry in the monster manual, right? The more you do that, the more you kind of wire your brain towards getting to the level that you want to be at to do this professionally, right? There was a guy whose name I'm not going to mention because he was a kind of a white male intellectual who turned out to be a complete douche. Big surprise. But he talked about this idea of if you want mastery at something, 10,000 hours is the magic number. Right. And I don't know if that's the exact number or not, but that idea is something I believe in very strongly. Right. You can't get great at something quickly. It's a long process of getting good and then getting better and then getting a little bit incrementally better after that. Right. So if you want to do anything creatively, you have to be able to commit to putting the time in. Right. You can start off writing little articles for yourself that no one else reads. There's nothing wrong with that. You can have a blog, just some excuse to say, I've got to write 1,000 words every week. Right. I know that that's something that's going to sort of improve my style and improve my craft. Right. So that's a big part of sort of the precursor to everything that we're going to talk about from here on.
I love it. Yeah. And one of the things we're not going to talk about on this video is marketing, getting an audience, things like that. But when you are doing the work that you're talking about, if you're constantly making little monsters, little pieces, little whatevers, and they can be related to your project in some way, you can be sharing those. And that also is like a litmus test. If people like your writing, if people like your creations, then that creates interest towards what you're actually creating. And it's that shows you that, oh, okay, it's working. And when I provide this actual larger project that I'm envisioning, that I'm passionate about, then there'll be a ready audience there. Yeah. All right. So I've got an idea. I've got this concept. I am in a place to move forward with it. I'm passionate about doing that. Should I then immediately jump in and start writing? What do I need to do? Should I start planning out, number of pages and chapters? Should I start thinking about structure and budget and page count and things like that? Like, do I need to should I be disciplined like that?
It really depends on the project. And I think if you were to graph sort of discipline as you say it, as you describe it versus anything else, page count is probably the most significant one, right? The bigger you expect your project to be, the more disciplined you want to be right from the start. If you know that you're writing a short adventure, right? You got this idea for a quick little thing. It's like a little site-based thing or a little bit of social interaction. You're pretty sure, this is maybe, like 1 or 2 sessions, right? Of average play for an average group. You can probably play pretty fast and loose. Like you can start off writing it, and then think to yourself, maybe this is, 10 pages, maybe it's 15, maybe it's 20. I don't know. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yep.
Yeah.
If you're 2
saying
chapters
to yourself,
or 3,
really
nobody cares. It's just organizational. Right? It's fine.
Yeah. If you're starting off saying, I want to do a book of new subclasses, right, for 5e, or if I want to do a campaign setting, for 5e or for any other game, or even something that's system neutral, right? Or for example, for us, when we said we want to put together a book of monster and encounter building advice, right? That's when you want to really do some legwork up front to say, okay, how big should this book be? Right. And if it's going to be this big, how am I going to organize it? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Because the organization gets very, very important that way.
Right. You want to and with Forge of Foes, we worked really hard at thinking about how do we divide up the type of information we're providing. Things like monster powers and how to toolkit a monster versus theory of how you compose encounters, right? And we had to think through all of these things that we're excited to write about. What is this organizational schema that's going to lead to some clear delineations in the product that will be great for you, right? That you'll look at this and it goes into later marketing, right? But that ability to say monster tips and tricks, building encounters, monster discussion and philosophy, monster toolkits, right? Really clear things that you're offering, and that you don't have 5 pages for one of them and 100 for the other, right?
Yeah. I mean, we went through, there were a number of different things we did on Forge of Foes. One was actually looking like section by section or even not even section by section, but topic by topic, saying, okay, this feels like a 1-page thing. This feels like 2 pages. Maybe this goes to 4 pages, right? Is 6 pages enough for this, or do we need to allocate more, right? There were discussions about, okay, once we know that, how do we order these things? Like, are there topics that sort of lend themselves nicely to a certain amount of flow, right? So you read the first one, and then the second one sort of builds on what you learned from the previous one. But at the same time, we wanted it to be a book that you didn't have to read cover to cover. You could just pop through and say, oh, this looks interesting. I'm going to read these 2 pages right before my game tonight. And then that's going to give me some useful insight, right? The other thing that we had to think about, and we'll talk much more about this later, but just to touch on it now, was the idea of how many pages we want the book to be in total. Because we were looking at things like, okay, we're getting this book offset printed. We know that if we go from X pages to X plus 16, okay, the print cost is going to increase by this much. The shipping cost is going to increase by this much.
And that is important. There is a way that books are printed that you reach magic numbers of pages and you end up in an entirely different cost bracket. So you kind of want that's why you tend to see similar page sizes for different products, because they're all aware of that. And so you can't just write, the way like when I wrote a nice, Tomb of Annihilation based supplement on the DM's Guild, like we were talking about before, it didn't matter how long it is. And I just chuck in art wherever I want and I'm good. Here, you have to really carefully think about this, because you just can't go 1 page over without a big
There's
cost.
another way to look at that question of how, what should I start thinking about when I write? And that's also the idea of how big should your project be based on what other projects that are similar are. Okay. Now, one thing that's easy to do, especially if you're just starting out, you're thinking, you know what, I'm not going to get this printed offset. I'm not even sure if I'm even going to do a print on demand option. And we'll talk about both those topics later on. I'm just going to do a PDF. So it doesn't matter how big it is. And that's kind of true, but also not. It doesn't matter how big it is in the sense of it doesn't cost me anymore to put out a 500-page PDF as opposed to a 300-page PDF. But you need to think about, does this project need to be a 500-page PDF, right? Or am I pushing past the point where people are going to be able to engage readily with it?
Yeah.
Right. And so again, like for bigger projects, you think about this stuff. If you're planning a campaign setting, you can say to yourself, how much detail do I want to go into here? Right. Yeah. How many areas am I talking about? How many pages do I want to devote to each of those? Yeah. And a really good thing to do at any stage of any kind of creative endeavor when you're working on something like this for games is to look at what other books are doing. Okay. If you can pick up another campaign setting that you really enjoyed and you say, oh, okay, this campaign setting is 256 pages, right? And it's packed full of all the information that I need. I really didn't feel like I was missing anything. That's a good starting point. Say to yourself, I should not be going over 256 pages with what I'm doing, because if I am, there's a chance that I may be giving people more than they want or need.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Especially as any particular game you're writing for is longer in its edition cycle and people's patiences are less. They have less space on their bookshelf, right? Any number of reasons. But also to keep to the sweet spot of what's great, leave people wanting more, all of that. One thing that's important also for people to realize is that you might pick up a gorgeous official book, and there's a reason it's so gorgeous. They have enormous art budget. And both the reality of who you are, who you're working with, dictates what kind of art you can get. Even if you go black and white, it's still a cost the more pages you have. Yeah. And also some types of products require very different types of art budgets. So monsters, for example, are notorious or infamous for surprising their creators, even third-party established companies, when they realize, oh, I need to commission art for every single page of this book. Single
page of the book, yeah.
And I have to give really clear instructions for each order. It can't just be some drop-in random art. I have to tell them what this monster looks like. So I have to have all my ideas in place, and I have to communicate them clearly, or I'll be disappointed and there'll be reworks. And that is just like this just became the most expensive book we've ever made. Yeah. And we didn't realize that, right? And so you want to think through this a bit of your length is cost, and if you're going to have any art in it and so on. And if you don't, well, then it'll look like a lot of words, and you'll have to think through that on the layout side of things.
Yeah. Yeah.
So is there anything else? So we're writing, We've got hopefully some sort of organizational schema if our project is bigger. We've got some goals, maybe chapters and page count and so on. Should we then write till we're done? Is there anything we should be doing before it's all, let's call it, written?
Yeah. Again, it's going to be a theme for this conversation. Yes and no. If the writing is something you're doing primarily for yourself, if this is like a passion project, there's no reason to not stop or to stop. There's no reason to not finish, right? You can absolutely keep going with the project. You can just, as long as you're enjoying working on it, work on it. If it gets to the point where you're like, I've written a lot of this and, I'm not as sure as when I started where it's going to go or how it's going to end up, there's also nothing wrong with stopping and taking a break. And again, anytime you take a break on one project, work on the next project immediately. Don't let yourself stall out. Right. Keep writing. Always be writing. Right. But there's certainly lots of things you can do at this very preliminary stage still. One is share your work with other people. Right. If you've got a gaming group and they're folks who like to read stuff, then say, hey, I'd love some feedback if anybody would like to have a look at this. Right. If you're comfortable extending that, you can say, please feel free to pass this on to any of your friends who you think might be interested in it. Right. If you're on a Discord that supports creative folks, right, where you're talking about each other's projects, you can ask if anybody there is interested in having a look at it. Right. You can potentially press gang members of your family into reading things for you. Right.
That's love.
If you want to get some kind of immediate feedback, right? Another thing that's really useful is, and again, this speaks to sort of like if you are going to take a break from something, right? Put it down for long enough that when you come back to it, you're kind of seeing it with fresh eyes. And that's another really strong reason to, when you put something down, work on something else to get the first project out of your head. Because when you come back to it with slightly fresh eyes, you will see things like another third-party reader will. You'll say, oh, okay, I was trying for something here and I didn't quite get there. And I didn't realize it when I was working on it. Because when I was working on it, it's all in my head. Right. And everything, the writing in my head is always perfect. The writing on the page, sometimes not. Because there's a process of imperfect translation between our head and what goes down.
We know what the words are trying to say. What we don't know is what the words actually say when you remove the knowing what the words are trying to say. Right. It's that extra little bit of coherence we're applying to it that makes it all feel better. And that's what stepping away helps, right? Because then you see it fresh and go, wait a minute, that's talking about different rules for bigger projects and smaller projects. If this is a bigger project, one thing you absolutely can and should do while you're working on stuff before it's finished is look at the word count, look at the page count, even just like, the page count on your word processor setup. And ask yourself, is this on track for what I want it to be? Right? If I'm planning on writing a 256 page campaign setting so that I know, okay, I've got, six regions and each of those is going to fit into like 150 pages, say, because the rest of the book is going to be, subclass options and mechanics and history and all that sort of thing. Right. And if you're consistently overwriting each of those sections, right, that's a sign to maybe say, okay, I am going to take a break from this and I'm going to go back and figure out what's going on here. And that's also a really good thing. Like pass it on to other people with not just a sense of, hey, tell me what you like and what you don't like, but say to them very specifically, I feel like I'm overwriting these sections. Can you give me any sense of, if you were reading this, if you were playing this, which things are least important to you? Are there any parts where you're going through and you're like, yeah, I really didn't, I skipped over this bit because I felt like it was more information than I needed. Right? Love it.
If you find yourself underwriting stuff, if you're like, wow, I've got all of the information in here that I thought I needed, but I've only written, 15 pages instead of 30, you can ask other people, hey, what more would you want to know about this? Right? Is there information here that I've developed that you think, oh, this is great. It's too bad it isn't, that there's not more story around that. Right?
Yeah. And this is great advice for freelancers too, because often on projects, a freelancer is given a word count and a topic. And you may find you're running either too many words or too few compared to what the target is. And that's where being able to go back and have a conversation about what the goal of this was. And conversely, if you're on the project side of things, working with freelancers and you're seeing they're consistently going over or under, that is indicative of what you're providing them information wise. That's triggering that too, right?
One thing that's very important that you can focus on, one thing you can teach yourself about is the idea of how many words go onto a page in an average book.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Because if that's something that you're not aware of, like if you think about your favorite game right now, and if I was to ask you, how many words are on a full page with no art of your favorite game, if you can't answer that question, you should figure that answer to that question out, right? Like literally take your book off the shelf and count up the number of lines in each column, right? Multiply that by 2 to get the number of lines on a page. Pick 10 lines at random, count the number of words in them to get an average, and figure out exactly how many words go onto that page.
Yeah. And so is that something like 1,250 per with no art and 1,000 with art, or what would you?
Here's the tricky question, or the tricky part.
Unless we're talking about third edition with its tiny font.
Well, I'm gonna educate you here.
All right, please.
Different games have different word counts because they have different layout styles. They have different font sizes. They have different fonts. Okay. There's no one standard. If anybody says, RPGs are usually about 1,000 words per page, or RPGs are usually 600 words per page, those numbers are absolutely true for certain games, but not for others.
Yeah.
Right. Third edition, famously, for the 3 core books, packed a lot of information into those core books, word for word, pound for pound. There's more stuff in the 3.5 core books than there is in any of the 5e core books. Right. But third edition then changed its editorial style for every book after that. So all the other books that were printed for third edition, adventures, supplements, even like follow-up monster manuals, all use a larger font and a more sort of like an airier layout, because it didn't need to pack as much information into the books as they initially did. Right.
Love it.
Fifth edition famously changed its layout style partway through the life cycle of the 2014 game. It was Tasha's, I'm pretty sure, was the first one, I think, that had the airier layout and the larger font, right? So that's an interesting question. I mean, that's an interesting scenario for freelancers who were working on 5e at the time, because the number of words per page literally changed. If you'd been used to saying, I'm writing an adventure, I know it's going to be X number of pages, my section that I'm working on, right? If you were working on it before that change, you had a number of words you could write to hit that length. If you're working on it after, the number of words went down, right? And maybe depending on the project, they would have said, okay, the number of words is going down. So instead of you writing 30 pages, you're now writing 34, right? But maybe it didn't, right?
That's great.
Maybe you were working on a project that you wrote using the old style and it got put in a book that was the new style, but you didn't know the new style was coming. And so some ham-fisted editor had to cut 30% of your content. Right? Editors, yeah. Right. So anyway, so when you're thinking about writing your book, right, get a sense not just of sort of how many pages I want to do, but also think about how many words that translates to based on what you think the book is going to look like. And we'll talk a lot more about that when we get down to talking about layout a little bit later.
All right. So I've got this book that I've, let's say, written. I've got words in a word processor, and I've written out the sections that I'm thinking of, so on. What should I do next? Should I hire an editor? Should I get this work developed? Should I be doing my own rewrites? What's kind of the order that you would suggest here? And maybe it varies again by who we are, but.
Yeah, I would say the first thing to do is to take a step back. And if you haven't gotten the work out to lots of people as you've been writing it, you definitely want to do that now. If this is a project that you've just been like, I'm just writing this for me. I love what I'm doing. I'm having the best time of my life. That's great. There's nothing wrong with that. But at some point, put it in front of the eyes of people who you're not going to pay to read it before you put it in front of people who you have to pay to read it.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Because once you start paying people to work on your stuff, right, you want to make sure that the stuff is as good as you can make it on your own before you get to that point.
Yeah. And this will be a theme that we don't want to have people do work on our words and then change our words, because now we must repeat that process, right?
Yeah, well, you should repeat that process, but a lot of people simply don't have the budget to do so, or the time sometimes. Yeah. So that's, we can talk about that later too. If in terms of who do I want to hire, okay, talking about an editor is the first step. And talking about an editor is the first bit of confusing RPG stuff that we're going to get into. Because when you hire an editor for an RPG, you could potentially be hiring one of 3 or 4 different types of people. Because there's different types of editing that go on in RPGs. Okay. So one word that you'll often hear talked about is copy editing. Okay. Copy editing is something that most people are familiar with. It's like if you're editing a newspaper article, if you don't know what a newspaper is, ask your parents. Editing a novel, getting someone to, to look over your blog post because you have certain weird tics when you're writing that you'd like someone else to catch because you don't see them, whatever it is, right? Mm-hmm. A copy editor is someone who simply focuses on the words. They make sure the words are in the correct order. They make sure there's no typos. They make sure there's no turns of phrase that are slightly incorrect. Mm-hmm. They make sure you haven't used the slightly incorrect version of a word instead of the correct version, that kind of stuff, right? Now, the reality is copy editing doesn't really happen in RPGs. Because in RPGs, even when someone says I'm a copy editor for RPGs, or even if you see somebody posting saying, "Hey, we're looking for a copy editor for our new game or for this new supplement," they're not actually asking for a copy editor. What they're asking for is a line editor. The difference between a copy editor and a line editor is a copy editor just focuses on the words. A line editor focuses on the words, but they also focus on the organization and the structure. Okay, so a copy editor will go through and give you 2 perfectly edited or 3 perfectly edited paragraphs, okay, in your book. A line editor will give you the same 3 perfectly edited paragraphs, but will give you a note saying the first paragraph should be up at the top because it's a better introduction than it is a summary. It sets up the other 2 paragraphs better. It creates a better flow. Okay, a line editor will say, I think the sections in this chapter are in the wrong order. Mm-hmm, right? A line editor will make sort of high-level content comments, or even if you've given them approval to do so, make those changes themselves, right? They will move those paragraphs around to say, this is the way this should be. Right?
That's really clear. Let me muddy it a bit from the perspective of the audience, which is, what about things like mechanics, the language of the game? Do we consider that to still fall in between? Like, is that like words?
It is. Yeah, it is strictly speaking not the purview of a line editor to do those things. And again, it gets confusing because very often when people say, yeah, I'm doing line editing for an RPG, or when people say we're hiring a line editor for this book, what they're actually asking for is a developmental editor, right? Mm-hmm. A developmental editor will give you 3 perfectly written paragraphs, will organize them exactly the way they need to be, but will also say to you, I don't think these 3 paragraphs need to be here at all. Mm-hmm. I think this whole section here isn't working and it should be rewritten.
So a developmental editor is bringing knowledge of the audience, of how this piece reads, and of the mechanics of the game itself.
Yes, a developmental editor brings in extensive knowledge of the game. That's the big difference between being a developmental editor or asking for a developmental edit and just asking for a line edit. If you get a really good line editor, okay, who's never worked on your game before, as long as you give them a style guide saying, here's the language of the game, here's how we do skill checks, here's how we do attack rolls, here's the style guide with all of our templated language. Mm-hmm. They should be able to turn over.
A character can make a
Yes, that line editor will be able to take the effectively edit action to actually make your book look exactly the way that you want it, even though they don't know anything about the game, because all they're focusing on is this is the language. I'm making sure that the language of the document matches up with this. A developmental editor knows the game well enough that they can take it to the next level, and they can say, okay, this is all okay, but it's not quite working the way you want it to. Developmental editing is especially acute when you're talking about editing adventures, because developmental editing then crosses over into something else, which in other fields is usually referred to as story editing, right? If you've got an editor who's working on your fiction, or if you've got someone who's giving you coverage on a screenplay, right? That sort of thing. What they're focusing on primarily is just the story. And because adventures are a story much more so than other forms of RPG writing, right? That becomes important. So a developmental editor working on an adventure is also saying, okay, The setup here is something you might want to review, right? It feels like the characters are maybe being pushed too far in this one direction. Maybe you need some more options. This section here, it's supposed to be a mystery, but the NPCs are doing all the problem solving. They're doing all the investigation. You're leaving nothing for the characters to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Even on non-adventure stuff, a developmental editor will say things like, this subclass feels underpowered compared to this other subclass you've got in your book. Is there things you want to do to address that? Okay. When you're talking about hiring an editor, what you want to hire, the person you want to hire almost always 1000% of the time is a developmental editor, because you want as much insight as you can bring to bear on a project. You want as much experience, as much of a sense of someone who not only knows the project you're working on, but knows a lot about how it's going to fit into the rest of the ecosystem, right? Because unlike writing a novel where someone's going to read that novel and you don't know what other novels they've read, when you're selling an RPG product to someone, you know that you're doing that on the foundation of they're already playing this game.
Yeah.
Right? Now, the tricky part is that when you hire an editor, any type of editor, right? Like whether it's just like you say, like, I just want to copy edit, but your copy editor's like, you know what? I've cleaned up your language, but I think you should really talk to somebody about some stuff here, right? Or you say, I just want a line editor, right? And the line editor says, yeah, I've reorganized some stuff here, but I think there may be, bigger issues, right? If you hire a developmental editor, and they do it as a single pass process, right? They're giving you all the story notes, all of the continuity notes. They're reorganizing content and then doing the actual like line by line, word by word edit. So the language is as clean and as crisp and as evocative and as clear as it can be, right? You end up in a terrible position if what comes back to you is something you think, hey, this is perfectly edited, and I now realize I've got to rewrite a lot of it. Because if you're in that position, then you have to ask yourself, okay, great. Now I've got my rewritten version. Do I hire another developmental editor to go through it again? Because that gets really expensive really fast. So one thing that I would
off all your timing and
if you've got like an actual, like a production timeline, like you're like, okay, I want to have this book out by such and such a date. I did a small Kickstarter. This is when I promised it to people. Yeah, that's a problem. Something that you can do and ask for. This is something that most developmental editors will also do. And if you got one who's not comfortable doing this, you can certainly ask around for other folks, is to just do what I would call a development pass, which is they're going to go through the document. They are not going to do any of the actual editing. They're not going to focus on any of the word level stuff or the paragraph level stuff. They're simply going to focus on the story and the mechanical issues. Okay. So you're going to get back from them a set of notes saying, hey, this section is really good. This section feels like it's not holding its weight, right? These three subclasses feel nicely balanced. I'm envisioning a situation where this character under these circumstances is going to alpha strike your boss every single time. And that's something you might want to think about. Okay. Doing a development pass, the advantage of that is it's less money, right? Because a development pass is much faster, right? So you can get someone to go over your stuff and give you a sense of what's working and what's not, so that you can then take that into a second or a third draft. If you've already written 2 or 3 drafts, it's your next draft, right? You're hopefully your final draft. Okay. Yeah. If you take the advice to heart, right? And even if it's a scenario where a development editor suggests something and you think, I'm not sure I want to do that, there's nothing wrong with that. It's always your book. But it's a good reason, it's a good excuse to ask other people to say, hey, this is what I wrote. This is the note I got back. Give me some feedback, right? Tell me what I should do here. Give me some suggestions for what might work here if what's here isn't working. Okay?
It's really easy to be protective of our babies. And one good thing about being a freelancer is you get used to the fact that it was never your baby in the first place. Yeah. And so therefore it can always be murdered off, or changed or transmuted or transformed.
Yeah.
But
it's a learning process either way, right? If you're freelancing, and especially if you're freelancing, for a relatively large company who's paying you well, it's a learning process where you earn money from it. So it makes it, more palatable. When you're paying someone to tell you that what you've written is wrong, right, that gets a little bit tougher. But I'm going to segue out of that, just do a little side note here. Talking about hiring any sort of editor, the one thing you absolutely want to look for, and you can find these people and you should not settle for less, are editors who are respectful of you and your work. Okay. If you end up working with an editor who just seems like they're in a position where they're telling you, well, that's not how I would have written this. This is how I would have written this. That's not the approach that an editor should be taking. Okay. When you're hiring an editor, just like hiring anybody, ask for references. Say, hey, I'd love to talk to some other folks who've worked with you, and get a sense from them of, yes, I worked with this person. They were wonderful. Or I worked with this person and their notes were really good, but they felt a little bit harsh to me. And if you know in your heart that you're a person for whom harsh notes are going to be tough to deal with, it's okay to say, even though this person's got some mad skills, maybe they're not the person I want to work with at this stage in my career, in this stage of what I'm doing creatively.
Yeah, it's. I mean, I have a fairly thick skin, and I've seen, you have sent me back pages that I've written, covered in red. In fact, I showed my kids as what I thought was perhaps a teachable lesson. Look, you might think of your dad as a good writer. Look how much red there is on this page. And they're like, oh, wow, that's incredible. And I'm like, yeah, and it's all better because, you have a very good touch that you can, it still reads like what I wrote. Yeah. Which is I think is a particular gift you have and a good editor has, that if I turn off track changes, I feel like it's the same thing I turned in. It just might read a little better, right? And you have a knowledge of, and I think it's a good thing to look for in an editor, that they are not just changing to change or towards a preference, but they're aware of what the text is trying to do and editing towards that. That makes sense?
Yeah. It absolutely does. And thank you for that. That's the highest compliment anybody can pay an editor. Yeah, is, I read the changes and it felt like something that I should have written or was, it felt like what I was trying to write in the first place.
Right.
Because as an editor, that's my approach, right? I look at stuff and it's never a matter, again, like for me, of saying that's not how I would have written it. What I'm doing is I'm looking at it saying, okay, I'm reading the whole book. I'm finding all of the high points. And I'm making sure that everything else matches those high points, right? I'm bringing everything up to the level that this writer is capable of doing, right? I'm trying to find their voice. I'm trying to mimic their voice to some degree to find some continuity and some consistency in how they're expressing themselves, right? And really what it comes down to often is just sort of fixing mechanical stuff, right? Or doing things, like I said, where it's like, you've got these 3 paragraphs here. I'm going to move the first paragraph down. And then because I do that, I got to make a change here so it lines up better, and I make a change here, right? And because I did that over here, we can cut a paragraph over here.
Yeah. Take extraneous words out so it's more direct, and so your message actually comes across versus getting lost, things like that.
Yeah. But anyway, so the asking for a development edit, especially if this is something you're just sort of starting out at, can be a really good idea. Right, to just do a development pass instead of a full development edit.
Maybe from what I'm hearing, the more that you are maybe getting feedback from folks that suggests, it's good, but there could be some sort of thing that needs a little work. If you get that kind of feedback from friends reading it, that might particularly lead towards, I'm going to get somebody who's a professional to give this quick pass, give me this feedback. That might really be some valuable insights into how I can shape it. And then I can be in the position where I do the longer edit.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. One of the things that's really great to ask when you're asking people to read your stuff for free, sort of where this is going back a bit, it's like a random access podcast, is to ask them specifically to point out things that are wrong. Because very often when we ask our friends to read stuff, they want to be as positive as they can be. And it may even be that, like if I pick up an RPG book, I'm looking for the stuff I like. I kind of, if there's something I don't like, I don't think about it that much. Right. I just focus on the stuff that's really cool. Yeah. So you may give them something and they come back to you and said, oh, this was cool. This was cool. This was cool. This was cool. And they won't tell you the stuff where they sort of got hung up on it because they didn't really think about it. They were just like, I'm focusing on the cool stuff. Yeah. But if you say to them specifically, and especially if you have a sense of, I really want this to work, instead of saying to them, I really want this to work, does it? Go to them and say, I'm not sure this is working. Right. Tell me what's wrong with it. Even if you yourself think there's nothing wrong with it, just do that as an intellectual exercise, because you'll be giving them permission or a focus to actually go in and find the stuff that needs to be fixed rather than just focusing on the stuff that doesn't need to be fixed.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Great. I love it. Love it. All right. So we have written, we've had maybe a developmental editing pass, which maybe triggered some rewriting to the point where we feel, okay, solid, it's ready for editing. We
Yeah.
do an editorial pass with a developmental editor.
Yes.
So we now have this text that is post development. That should mean I'm not going to change it further.
Yes, that's absolutely what it should mean. That doesn't happen though. And that's not endemic just to RPG stuff. That's, fiction, film, everything. Right. I was sharing an anecdote the other day about how I was one of the first people to see The Phantom Menace because I had a media preview because I was working for a newspaper in Vancouver at the time. And one thing that was interesting to me was in the original media preview, Darth Maul doesn't get cut in half.
Oh, wow.
Right. When he's tumbling down the thing, you just see his body disappear. And I was excited because I thought, this is great. He's obviously going to come back. He's a badass villain, right? And George Lucas got so much. Well, here's the thing. George Lucas got so much feedback from preview audiences along that same lines. He said, I don't want him to come back. He's supposed to be dead. I better make that clear. And so in the theatrical releases, right, like this was a change that was made literally while the film was going out to theaters, right? They made that change so Darth Maul gets cut in half and then comes back anyway. But
with spider
Hollywood,
legs.
right?
So yeah. Gotta love it.
But books will have changes made right up to the very last minute. And this is problematic. And you got to be sort of aware that this is an issue and aware of things you can do to make that better. But assuming that you've got the text,
let's make it really clear, like why it's problematic.
It's problematic for the same reason that it's problematic to have a development editor do a first pass on your book that puts you in a position where you got to do a lot of rewrites. Because you do a lot of rewrites and you're like, hey, I'm happy with this. I feel like I got some great advice. Things are better now. But your rewrites haven't been reviewed or edited the same way that your initial draft was, right? And you can absolutely say to somebody else, hey, like you can go back to the same editor and say, hey, I've rewritten the first chapter. Will you edit this again for me? And they will probably say, yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah.
But you're paying them again to do it, right? Now, and if you don't have an infinite editing budget, if you have an infinite editing budget, call me. But if you don't have an infinite editing budget, right, then you're going to get to a point where you're like, I can't afford to get somebody else to look at this again. I've got to do the best job I can. And the problem is that even though the best job you can do is probably really, really good, right, because you're a really good writer, you've got a great sense of mechanics, a great sense of story, you're not going to see things, right? Because we all have areas that we cannot focus on in our own work, right? We sort of just end up, they end up blurred out to us. Right. We can't focus in to clarify them enough to see them with the kind of clarity that we need to fix them. Okay. So try to focus on doing as few changes after the edit is done as you possibly can. I talked about 4 different types of editors potentially, and I only mentioned 3. The 4th one is a developer. Okay. A developer is kind of like an editor, but they are focused exclusively on rules. They're not necessarily looking at the story. They're absolutely not looking at whether your paragraphs are in the right order. They're simply looking at the mechanics going, this subclass is great, but it's doing 3.5 points less damage than this other subclass from the player's handbook, right? That's the kind of granularity that a good developer will give you. Right. They'll say, this spell here is okay, right? But it's underpowered for its level. So you have to make a choice. Do you lower the level of it, which might mess up other stuff if you've got like spell lists and things and you had them organized a certain way? Or do you increase the potency of the spell? They will look at a monster stat block and say, this monster's melee attack is grossly overpowering its ranged attack. If that's by design, right? What's the reason for that? How do you explain that in the narrative? Do you want to boost the range attack up? Do you want to just lose the ranged attack? Is it just basically fill in space? Because you got a ranged attack and a stat block that no DM is ever going to use. Yeah. Right. So a good developmental editor, if they know the system really well, will do those things for you as well if you ask them to. But you may also want a developer on the book as well. Right, just to focus in on purely the mechanical stuff, especially if you're doing something like a book of subclasses or a book of monsters, where the mechanics are first and foremost what you're trying to sell to people, right? But all of that said, you've got a manuscript and you're quite happy with it, and it's been through enough stuff and you're ready to take it to the next level. The next level is thinking about layout.
Right? Let me ask before this.
Yes.
Where does it come? Where do we go into proofreading and sensitivity reading?
Oh, that's an excellent point. Yeah, should
Would
have
that
talked
be
about sensitivity
before
reading.
editing?
It can be both. And this is the tricky part. Again, when you're looking at something, you want it to be as like a one pass solution, ideally. Okay. Sensitivity reading. The optimal time to do it is when the book is as close to finished as possible. Okay. Because that way you're not in a position where your sensitivity or your cultural consultant reader is looking at the book and then a bunch of stuff gets added to it later on, right? Because which they then don't get a chance to review. Now, the tricky part is that the other optimal time to get a sensitivity reader and a culture consultant is right from the beginning, so that they can review the whole thing and be in a position to, like the development editor, like the person doing a development pass with story notes and continuity notes, they can say to you, hey, here's some stuff you should be aware of right now. Okay.
So
At the very least, sorry, I was just going to say, at the very least, get that kind of consulting in before you go to layout. And we'll talk about that when we get down to layout and the perils of rewriting your book when you're at layout, because inevitably that will happen. Like if your cultural consultant will say, hey, this is all great. Here's one thing you absolutely need to change. And you'll think, oh, I had not thought about any of those issues, right? They're outside of my own experience. I would never have imagined that would be an issue because this, the kind of stuff that's being discussed isn't something that's a part of my life, but I know that I have to now change it. And then you're in a position where you're rewriting stuff at the layout stage. And that's something you want to try to avoid.
Right. So then it may be something to do is to look at, like, I'm writing a core role-playing game book. It's got species in it.
Yep.
I might as well get that looked at early on in the process, because that may require so much rework that doing it up front is great. Or I've got this adventure and there's this part that involves a bunch of peoples that we are interacting with. So getting that reviewed early can make a lot of sense versus at the end.
Yeah, it's absolutely okay to ask a sensitivity reader or a cultural consultant if they will focus in on one section, right? Like you might want to say to them, hey, I'd like you to review the ancestries section of this thing that I'm doing, or I'd like you to review the history section of this adventure that I'm writing or this campaign setting, right? So they can give you initial notes on that, and then you might want to bring them back to read the entire game, the entire book later on, right?
Gotcha. And that would be when it's actually in layout or right before layout?
Right before layout is ideal. Like when the book is as close to layout, when you're in this imaginary dreamlike state where you think, if I flow this copy, I could print this book, it would be perfect. Okay. That's the best time. That's a great time to bring somebody in for a final pass on the cultural and the sensitivity issues.